So this is, I guess I gave it two titles, fabulous fall vegetables, but with a little bit of an homage to football time in Tennessee, it is also getting close to turnip time in Tennessee. So this is just kind of an overview of some of the general practices and timing, but also some crops and cultivars that work well kind of for varying stages of fall gardening. And I will say that for me, fall gardening in Tennessee is one of my favorite things. We come through a pretty hot summer, and it's great to think about some cooler temperatures, even some shorter days, and some leafy, shorter season crops. So for gardeners who sometimes get overwhelmed with disease management and pest management and some of our warm season crops, or even just the volume of picking that it takes, in smaller spaces, fall garden crops can be really good for beginners, and as kind of a way to get integrated into growing your own food. They're very space efficient, they're time efficient. A lot of what we'll talk about today is in the 45 or 50 days or below types of range. And a lot of these can be grown really well in raised beds, even containers. So they're a great place to begin. Some other assets are that when we start to get cool nights, that can equal great taste. So it's kind of a physiological process that we refer to as cold acclimation. But what's really happening is as we start to get some cooler nights, and those are kind of slightly above freezing, but for a few days in a row, what that plant starts to do is convert starches to soluble sugars. And so, this, you've tasted it. The brassica family does this a lot, right? So cabbage, collards, kale. Sometimes we'll see it also in our carrots. So we can actually have not only some lower pest and disease management issues, but also better taste out of these cool season crops when we grow them into the fall. And so, of course, if we're also implementing some season extension practices, I know it's a little light, but there's a row cover there in the background. We can get all the way, well, depending upon the crop, all the way into harvesting next spring. And of course, you have the benefits of less sweating. Now, there are some challenges because, I had that slide where I talked about, well, it's cooler, easier to work and all those types of things. And that's true if we're harvesting, in September, October, or the early part of November. But the challenge for fall crops is that we need to start right now for many of them. So for a lot of our longer season fall crops, you think about your cabbage, you think about your broccoli, especially the cauliflower and Brussels sprouts, we should be getting them in the ground right now. So most of the time for East Tennessee, we're talking about, early August to mid-August. We get in the more western parts of the state, and we're talking about, all the way where we want to get those longer season crops in by the early part of September. So that means that when it's hot and dry in the August-September periods, we need to be getting those young plants established. And so watering, fertilization, and especially the early season weed and pest control. And so it does require a little bit of vigilance in this late summer period, because the key to leafy crops is to get them growing at a rapid rate of speed and continue that growth rate, right? So we want to get those leafy crops growing quickly with water, with nutrients, but a lot more nitrogen. And we want to keep that growth rate consistent, right? So we never want them to dry out with their more shallow root system. So, our August and September practices are really important for a good crop. So that's a little bit of the big picture overview. Really, what we're going to talk about a lot are some of the crop options and some of the cultivar trials that I've done. Some of these, most of these are Knoxville pictures and images. And then at the end, we're going to talk just a little bit about, some of the key practices in fertilization and those types of things. A few quick notes. It is not necessarily too late for some of our warm season crops. If you direct seed, some little snacker cucumbers or something like that, you could get to harvest in, 35 or 40 days on those. So it's possible, but we're not really going to talk about that because, you know, the plans would pretty much already be made if you're going to get in the end of your warm season crops. We're really going to focus more on kind of the lower risk, versatile, cool season crops, lettuce, you know, kale, collards, those types of things. So timing and time invested in getting these established and growing is really everything. So we're going to kind of start with the easier ones and move up to some of the more challenging or the longer season cool crops. So we're going to start with leaves, and then we'll talk about roots, then we'll talk about flowers. So we're kind of going to go by the edible plant part as we do this discussion. So the big benefit for leafy crops is their speed, right? Because if you're growing, you know, baby lettuce, baby kale, a lot of these smaller cool season crops like we're looking at in this picture right here, you can literally be eating in 25 to 40 days. Now these days vary a little bit in the fall. Lots of times we'll say that we'll add about 10 days to the days to harvest for our fall crops. Just because, I mean, we think about the difference between an April day and an October day, right? You know, your average temperature, especially day length, right? So those types of things, we're getting shorter instead of getting longer. So lots of times we will add a little bit, but we can still, you know, month and a half for a lot of these leafy crops. There's also some benefit in a lot of versatility as far as color and flavor. This picture that you're looking at right here is actually a multi-seed pellet. So there's about 5 seeds that grew this container right here. And you can see there's some pak choi, there's some mustard, there's some azuna, there's some kale. So it's just a wide range of brassica crops here. So on a small scale, these can be great for containers. And so you have some of the milder brassicas like the pak choi and the kale. You've got a little bit more punch in your pungency and your flavor with some of the mustards and the mizunas. And you know, they're also, right, interesting, and they're very low risk, right? If anything goes wrong, just seed some more. So that's kind of where we're going to start with the leafy crops. And the first one we're going to talk about is lettuce. And so the easiest lettuce crop to grow would be a direct seeded lettuce crop. And, you know, the days to harvest is going to be anywhere from 30 to 50, right? Depending upon your preference as far as maturity and the time of season that you're going to be growing them. And you really have still, you know, a little bit of time for lettuce. Lots of times we'll say, you know, try to get those in the ground by the 1st of September in the eastern part of the state, by the middle of September in the western part of the state. This picture in the background here was actually seeded in late September. This is a Knoxville shot, and it was taken on the 3rd of January. Now, I'm not promising that that's, you know, going to happen every year, but some years, you know, we get that slow taper of temperatures and we can harvest lettuce, you know, into the winter. Now, lettuce is not one of our toughest cool season crops. You know, it should be able to handle the, you know, mid-20s kinds of temperature ranges if, you know, if the temperature drops slowly. If you're going to direct seed it, then lots of times the seeding rate will be, you know, 40 to 60 seeds per foot. In the background here, there's Green Star, there's Tropicana, there's 2 Star. So those are some of our most common green ones. And we see New Red Fire, but there's also a lot of great mixes, and those can be a very good place to start. So one of my favorite things about growing lettuce in the cool season is that when we start to get those lower temperatures, we get more vibrancy in colors. So I promise that I won't dive in too deep here, but this is actually a shot from my PhD dissertation, lettuce. And so that red pigmentation can be a protectant for that plant against cold temperatures. And so we get into the cool seasons and we get some beautiful colors out of a lot of our leaf and head lettuces. So leaf lettuce is a great, easy place to start. If you want to get a little bit larger, like more volume harvest and individual heads, then butter leaf and oak leaf are great head lettuce crops. So I'm not going to be talking about iceberg lettuce. Iceberg lettuce goes great in the Salinas Valley of California. It is really challenging to grow here, whether it's fall or whether it's spring, we just don't have quite the environmental conditions necessary for head development. So butterhead and oak leaf are some of the great tasting, great color options, and they're much easier to grow to a pretty good maturity. So most of the time I will grow transplants for these, or you can buy transplants. And those will be a spacing of, anywhere from 6 to 12 inches. And if you've got a raised bed, plant them in a grid, it works pretty well. 3 to 4 weeks to transplant, and then anywhere from, another 2 or 3 weeks to another 4 or 5 weeks, depending upon how warm it is, how fast the crop's growing, but also how large, you want it to be. So this is a small oak leaf that's in the background here. I think this is actually Panisse. But we have some beautiful reds. Oscard is a red. And then some of the butterheads, Nancy, Adriana, are good greens. Skyphos and Red Cross are really pretty reds. This is actually Nancy right here. So this once again is a really late winter harvested butterhead, but you can see really nice fill on those heads. No tip burn, which is pretty awesome for a fall crop, right? So they're easier to get to maturity with a really good quality than what we might see in our summer crops. This is a red oak leaf. So this is actually Salanova, but this is kind of what Oscard looks like. So you see the beautiful coloration, really tight, consistent plant. And then of course you have the romaines. So some of our traditionals would be like Paris Island, Green Forest, Coastal Star, Salvias. When I say traditional, I don't necessarily mean romaine hearts, right? Because that's what we buy from the grocery store. But most of what will grow in our garden will be a little bit more open head. And so we have a lot more deep green tissue, which can actually be good for health content, phytonutrient content. Winter Density is one is the one that's actually in this picture. And it's a nice, more compact lettuce head. Some of the smaller mini heads you can get now. So Dragoon is a red, Outrageous, Annapolis. Those are romaines, but lots of times they're also grown for leaf lettuce. So lots of times you'll find those in mixes. And keep in mind that that romaine will take just a little bit longer most of the time to mature to a full head, but you can harvest them really at any stage. So I would think 45, 50 days in the ground most of the time. And while they can germinate at pretty low temperatures, most of the time I probably do a transplant for these just so that you can get your spacing and your plant population pretty consistent. Then of course, we have the staple of the Southern garden, collards. So these can be transplanted or direct seeded. If you get a little bit later in the season, I would transplant them mostly just as a time. And as with any leafy crop, but especially our brassica crops, rapid growth is important. So we want consistent moisture and we want good nitrogen availability. The thing to think about with collards and, broccoli and many of the other brassicas is that we're still in caterpillar time of year, right? So we might want to think about row covers and things like that to protect from the lepidopteran pests. Of course, we could use insecticides like Dipel and BT. Those are natural organic products. One of the benefits of not having as much rain in September, October is that it would be easier to keep those, insecticides actually on our plants because the caterpillar needs to ingest them. So, anytime you think about brassicas, think about pest control. There are lots of great longer season cabbages that, are storage cabbages. I tend to grow the smaller head cabbages a little bit more often. This is Tierra that you see here in the background. So it's more of a, they call them individual serving. It's not really, but it's about a 5-inch head across. And so these will mature a little bit faster in the ground, anywhere from 40 to 55 days after transplanting. So, if you put it in the ground the 1st of September, by the middle of October, you have a good lettuce head. And you can also space them a little bit closer. So you can put these at 8 to 10 inches instead of like 1.5 feet. So if you're growing in a raised bed, it works a whole lot better. These are a few options for fall. Ruby Perfection is a really nice red. It has a long storage life, so it can be good for fall crops. And then some of the other mini heads, Caraflex is pointed. Katarina is actually the one that's in this picture here, so you can see pretty nice, small, tight head, a quicker maturity. Kale is, of course, you know, a crop that's gotten a lot of press over the last half a dozen years. And I will say that I really like baby kale. You get it more mature and it starts to get tougher, you know, in the stems. So funny story about kale. My sister-in-law fed my brother and my niece kale for the first time this year. She was trying to broaden their horizons. And my brother says that kale is like eating rope. So, you know, you got to get the baby kale to keep it nice and tender. And so you can see that picture there. This is direct seeded. And that's, you know, only about a 25-day-old crop that's in that picture right there. If you want the larger size, then yeah, go ahead and do transplant. My favorite thing about kale is that you get such a long harvest season out of it because most of the time it will completely overwinter in our climate. Once again, you know, it tastes better in November oftentimes than it does in May. So some of the more traditional kind of frilly leaf kales, winter boar. I say winter boar kale looks like what we used to get at Shoney's, you know, in the 90s when you get like the leaf of kale and the you know, the orange slice. So those are our more traditional leaf kales. Red boar is gorgeous, a really dark color, especially once you get into the colder parts of the year. Scarlet is the cultivar that's in the background here. It's an open pollinated type. It doesn't get quite as deep red, but it is a really pretty leaf. Prism is a shorter stature green. I've got a picture of it here in the next slide. Some of my favorites are the Italian Toscano. And I think they have a little bit more tender leaf, a little bit less distinct midrib. So some of that, you know, chewing on the veins of your kale is a little bit easier. This is Prism, and this is actually a shot that was taken in May. So, you know, this was a September planted crop that overwintered, and you can see a really nice spring yield that you can get out of these crops. Now, they're biennial, so you get into the late spring and they will bloom, right, and stop growing. But you can lots of times get a nice March and April harvest out of these kale. If you want a few different things, some pak choi can be a great option, a milder flavor. You can eat these as baby leafed, as mixed greens. There's some beautiful small reds. So they can add kind of a softer texture and a milder flavor. This is Red Kingdom mustard. So we're starting to get into the slightly more pungent crops, but some of the newer mustards are, you know, still kind of mild. They're not going to be, you know, really distinct. You can eat these as baby crops, as mature crops, lots of beautiful leaf colors and textures. For those of you who want to add just a little bit of spice to the salad, arugula, especially as a fall crop, right? So arugula as a spring crop is a challenge because it gets hot and the pungency really goes up. It starts to flower quickly. But I think as a fall crop, arugula can be more attractive. And we also keep down the stress on those plants, and the flavor, I think, stays better a little bit longer. I would still probably harvest it as a baby crop, pretty short season. Arugula is pretty fast, right? So it can germinate in, you know, 24 to 48 hours under good conditions. This is a microgreen. I grow it as a microgreen a lot, but Astro, there are several cultivars that you can grow. I put spinach last on the leafy crops because I was kind of going chronologically as they can handle cold temperatures, right? So lettuce, you know, in the mid 20s, if it's really well acclimated and it has a cover, you know, you might be able to get to the low to 20. Spinach is going to be one of the toughest crops that you can grow, and it typically will over winter. So, you know, it's typically towards the end, you know, we can get by with into October seedings for a lot of the areas in which we live. Spinach can be sometimes tricky to germinate. It's a little bit picky about its temperature. If it's too warm, it won't germinate very well. If it's too moist, you know, it can be a challenge. So lots of times, even if I'm growing a fairly baby spinach, I will go ahead and transplant it just so that I can be sure that I'm getting good transplants in the ground. So those are kind of the level one, right? So leafy crops, simple and easy to grow, great place to start. Pretty much everything that we talked about can grow in a raised bed, can grow in a container. And then we move on to the root crops. So of course, one of my favorite things about the root crops is that they feel like fall, right? There's nothing like eating a turnip right out of the field that, you know, it makes it feel like fall. And so whether you're growing them for greens or whether you're growing them for roots, I tend to harvest kind of on the smaller side. And so a lot of the cultivars that I'll grow will be the shorter days to maturity. So like Hikura, and there some of the good cultivars that we have, options that we have now, actually have, you know, more hairless tops. So they're kind of an either or. You can harvest them as turnip greens, or you can harvest them as a smaller turnip root. They can, of course, take some cooler temperatures. We just don't want the ground to freeze hard with those turnips still in the ground. And like we talked about with the accumulation of soluble sugars, you know, if we leave them in during the time when we're, you know, slowly getting cooler temperatures, then lots of times we will get the soluble sugars up in those turnip roots. Beets are one that we can also grow as a fall crop. Now we want to be careful as we start to get into the cooler parts of the season, but there are some shorter days to harvest beets that could be good options for fall. This is a picture right here is actually of a baby beet, right? So a smaller root. And the other thing is, if we don't quite have enough time to mature a root, you know, we want to get these in the ground by, you know, the middle of September or so if we wanted to get a good beet root. But we could grow them in the fall for a leafy crop, right? And not really even harvest the root. And so then we'd have a little bit of time. We could, you know, go through the end of September, maybe even the early part of October, depending on what our part of the state. So there are some folks that actually transplant these because, you know, beets can be a little bit nuanced on their germination. Here's an example of some of the novel ones. Now, this would be one that you'd want to get in early season if you want to get that larger root. The other option for root crops, of course, would be fast root crops would be radishes. So, you know, your smaller cherry bell and those types, you know, you can get mature lots of times in under a month. But there are some longer season, larger radishes, which are some of what I'm growing this fall. So this is Sweet Baby we're going to have in our trials. Some of the watermelon radishes, those types of things, a little bit longer days to maturity. They may be up in that 40 to 45 range. And once again, because they're not going to bolt on you like they will in the springtime with the heat, you can leave them in the ground for a little bit longer. Carrots, I will say, is a cool season crop that that I don't even bother to go in the springtime. I just save it till the fall for taste and all those types of things, especially the smaller ones like Rondo, Atlas are really small. We call them Parisian, but they're almost like little round carrots, better for clay, heavier soils. Of course, carrots can, you know, be nuanced for their germination. So we want good moisture and nitrogen to keep them growing well. We don't want any stress because that can be what sometimes brings in those off flavors. But it's easier to get, you know, the sweeter, better carrot flavor growing in the cooler times of year. And they can be left in the ground, you know, for a long time after harvest as well, because, you know, the time's cooler, the day lengths are shorter, they're not really growing. As long as we don't get a hard freeze, it's essentially cold storage. So we have lots of options. There are a lot of fall storage carrots that you can get on the market. Sugar snacks would be an example. And then, of course, we have the whole range of colored forms. So rainbow, yellow, some of the beautiful deep purples that we have with the whole varied pigmentation. So we talked about leafy crops, we talked about root crops, and now, of course, we kind of get to the harvesting of floral parts, right? So this, of course, broccoli, cauliflower, those types of brassica crops. This is actually a Brussels sprout kale hybrid in the springtime, right? So this is a biennial blooming in the spring. We don't want these kinds of flowers, but it's just just a reminder that sometimes in the springtime, especially cauliflower and Brussels sprouts are challenging crops to grow in our climate because they're longer season, the temperature raises so quickly, they're tough. So it can be a much better growing environment in the fall because they're maturing into cooler temperatures. So pretty much all of these we're going to grow as a transplant crop. And many of these we would want to get in by, mid-August in the cooler parts of the state, early September in the warmer parts of the state. And, for kind of a lot of our traditional head broccolis, we might say, between 50 and 70 days to maturity. But we also have a lot more options as far as sprouting and mini broccolis than we used to. I don't have any pictures. They're going to be in the trial this year, but some of the broccolis that I'm growing this year are minis, right? So we're harvesting, sometimes more side shoots instead of that main growing point, and those can be anywhere from 30 to 40 days after transplant, so we can really cut down that production time. Once again, consistent water, consistent moisture. Arcadia, Marathon, those are some crops that are kind of selected to mature into the fall season. And then I already mentioned stem or sprouting broccoli, which can be some of these mini heads, which are, a little bit lower risk to grow. And so this is Artwork, which is a recent All-American Selections winner. Some of the ones that I'm growing in the trial this year kind of fall in this type of category. Brussels sprouts are, one of the more challenging cool season crops to grow. And that has to do, of course, with their long season of maturity. So kind of our older open pollinated crops, cultivars might be more than 100 days to harvest. Some of our newer hybrids might be in that 80 to 85 day range. But if you, start to count, 80 days after transplanting, which is typically what is going to be on the seed packet, right? So if it's a typically transplanted crop like broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, then the days to harvest on your seed packet is going to be from transplant. If it's a typically direct seeded crop like spinach, that days to harvest is going to be from direct seed. So, we want 2.5 to 3 months growing season. So, if you transplant in the middle of August, then it's the middle of November when you get to harvest for a lot of these. So you would need to have your transplants, pretty much ready to go, or, go buy them at this time of year. I have grown the Brussels sprouts kale hybrid. It is really cute, tiny little open kale heads, in the locations on the stem like Brussels sprouts, but I would say it's probably not your highest volume crop if that's what you're growing for. Oh, and I'll throw in kohlrabi, which actually I will say is one of my favorite newer brassica crops to grow. It's kind of like a turnip, but you get to watch it grow because it's out of the ground. So it is an enlarged stem that we're eating on the kohlrabi about 40 to 50 days after transplant, or a little bit quicker if you eat them small. I've harvested, up to 4 or 5, 6 inches in diameter, but you can definitely harvest them much smaller than that. Conan, course, are some of the newer cultivars. I know we're talking about fall crops, but I've had pretty good luck with kohlrabi as a spring crop as well, as far as maintaining good flavor, even with a May, early June harvest. So if you haven't grown kohlrabi before, try some. There are also some beautiful purple cultivars. All right, so that was a quick tour of some of the great crop options that we have. So kind of the easier lettuce crops, pretty easy, but medium root crops, and then some of the we'll need to pay more attention types of flowering crops. And for the last few minutes, I just want to talk a little bit about some of our practices, some of the main things to keep in mind as far as growing cool season crops. So of course, that we are going to talk about soil and site preparation. And I think that one of the biggest things for fall gardens is to make sure that we don't bring in any issues from our previous summer crops, right? So right now it's in the middle of August and we're all getting a little bit lax on our weeding and those types of things. So having a site that is really well prepared for good growth in a fall crop One of the potentially most useful things that we could do is, instead of trying to like line up a spring crop, a summer crop, a fall crop in the same growing area, grow a spring crop and then a fall crop, and kind of use that summer as a solarization or a cover crop. So you're not trying to, say, pull out a tomato or a zucchini crop to get in your cool season crop. You're literally just tilling in a cover crop or something like that, and it allows you to control your timing a little bit better, so you don't have to feel like, oh no, I'm losing tomato yield because I really need to get my broccoli and cauliflower in right now. Keep rotations in mind, and don't forget fertility. So we're going to talk just a little bit about some of these specifics. One thing to keep in mind, of course, in Tennessee, we can literally garden for 10 or 11 months a year, depending upon if we're using row covers and how many seasons we're growing in. I would think about rotating my cool, and warm season crops. So don't always grow your early spring and your late fall crops in the same area, because if you grow, your lettuce and your spinach through November and December, or even keep that kale over winter, you're not going to be able to get a good cover crop biomass over as a winter cover crop. So those are going to be areas where you're not going to be adding more organic matter through the season. So, I wouldn't grow my fall crop in the same area. I would try to move that around, both, for good disease risk, lowering disease risk, but also to make sure that you're getting cover crop grown in a lot of your garden most years. And the other thing to keep in mind is that rotation that we always talk about means that we don't want our spring and fall crops to be in the same family if they are growing in the same area, right? So, lettuce in the spring, broccoli in the fall, those kinds of things. We don't want it to, and there's a lot of crops we can grow with brassica, right? So we don't always want it to be, radishes, then kale, then broccoli. Those are all in the same family. The other thing to keep in mind is that some good cover crops are also in the brassica family, like tillage radishes. So this is just an example, more probably to keep in mind for next summer than this summer, because we're getting close to the end of when you could carry out summer solarization. But if you're a spring crop and then you got a little bit of time before you grow your fall crop, solarization could be a great way to reduce the disease risk. For our direct seeded crops, sometimes we deal with that damping off types of issue. And so these can be a great way to address some of those, just always present in small amounts in our soil, Pythium, Rhizoctonia, those kinds of things. And it can also improve the weed management potential, right? Because in that first top inches of soil, we can reduce that weed seed bank for carrots and those types of things that aren't good competitors against weeds. But don't till after you get your soil solarization done. Now, this will take 6 or 8 weeks. So this can kind of be, July and August, and then head into some cool season crops. A summer cover crop could also be great. This is a summer buckwheat from one of my plots at the UT Gardens from a few years ago. Buckwheat is really nice because it's a fast season crop. It's easy to till if you till it back in. It doesn't have a lot of those, strong stems and things like that. Or you can even cut and leave as a mulch if you want to do reduced tillage. So there's lots of reasons that buckwheat and some of those short season cover crops can be handy. But also, as we head into fall crop, I would say don't forget fertility. These are the types of pictures that sometimes I get in as we start to head into the fall season. Keep in mind that our brassicas, our lettuces, our spinach, all of those cool season crops are nitrogen hungry types of crops. And so we want to get a little bit of fertilizer on there as a pre-plant, which will provide, our N, P, and K if necessary. But then most of these, if you're harvesting a leaf lettuce and it's 25 days, you may not have time for a side dressing. But most of our broccoli, collards, cauliflower, longer season lettuces, those types of things, we'll do a nitrogen side dressing at about, anywhere from 25 to 40 days after seeding. And so that's, about half a pound per 100 feet, half a pound of ammonium nitrate per 100 feet of row. So getting on a nitrogen as a side dressing will keep this growth rate rapid. Of course, we want to make sure there's plenty of soil moisture, or our fertilization is not going to do us any good. This is an example of a little bit of hungry turnip crops. So I talked about how we can get redder colors under cooler nights. That's true. We can also get redder colors when they're nitrogen deficient. So, you know, those can kind of be cross indicators. These are just some numbers, and many, you know, you guys are agriculturalists, you know these, but I always think it's fun to put some numbers to kind of our personal experiences. We know that, you know, July is often, surprisingly enough, one of our wettest months, but as we head into that August, September, October timeframe, that often tends to be the lowest traditional precipitation months. And that's when we need to get our young plants growing. So when it's hot and when we're getting lower rainfall, we really have to pay attention to watering. But, you know, as much as possible, drip irrigation, because some of these brassica crops, you know, do have some leaf diseases that they can get. A few final suggestions here as we think about insect protection, but also season extension and climate heading into the fall. This is a really cool example of some of the screen material that's available for some of our raised beds or small garden areas. We talked about the challenges of controlling fall armyworms and cabbage lopers and, you know, all those types of things. Well, a screen that is well applied from early in the growing season can be a great way to exclude some of those pests. If you look at that, you know, collards underneath of that screen, you know, we don't see any feeding from leaf chewing caterpillars. So getting it on early is important. This is a really fine mesh screen that, well, I mean, it'll trap a little bit of heat, but it won't trap a ton of heat. And so this would be good for kind of that late summer time frame when you don't want to really increase the temperature under that row cover, but you do want to keep out the pests. Now, row covers, thin row covers can also work for this late summer and fall time of year. This is a really light agribon, and it's, you know, it will trap a little bit of heat, but it'll do a very good job at excluding moths that want to lay eggs and those types of things if you get it on early and keep it tight. So I just mentioned the floating row cover. Floating row covers are easy to install, but there are a little bit of drawbacks, especially once you get into the colder parts of the year. I use this picture on purpose just so you could see, this is, you know, late December, early January heads of lettuce, right? So they've been in the ground for a long time. But if the row cover is sitting on top of those heads of lettuce, then you can get, you know, damage right where that cold temperature went through that row cover and contacted the plant. So support, you know, whether with a small, you know, metal frame or whether with a PVC pipe, can provide airspace, which will, you know, buffer the temperature change, but it'll also keep that row cover from riding on top of your plants and causing some abrasion with heavy wind and those kinds of things. You can see there, I just put, I got small 2x2s from Lowe's, and I just rolled up the end of my row cover and stapled that down, or tacked it down with lath and, you know, and tiny little nails, and kind of created the edges that held down my row cover. Just make sure that you have enough extra row cover so that the plants can grow and you're not, you know, really holding them down too tight. You can also use these in combination inside high tunnels and things like that. So they can be very versatile. Then of course you have low tunnel, which is the same type of principle. It's just a slightly different type of material. So this is just really thin greenhouse plastic. This is about 1/6 the thickness of what we would put on for a greenhouse. And you can see it there. This is a late November, early December picture of lettuce underneath of a low tunnel, and it is slitted. So, so it doesn't get too hot under there, but it does kind of keep the rain out. It keeps the leaves a little bit drier, but it means you got to pay attention to watering. Because you'll get some seepage under the edges, but it may not completely be enough in dry season. So you do need to keep an eye on watering. These work great if you have drip irrigation. A little bit better protection against wind and things like that, so you don't get abrasion on your crops. Access is more annoying, right? Because you got to, pull up the edges to get in and out to see your crops. And what I did here, I don't know if you can kind of see on the edge, that's just really thin lath. And I rolled the edges of the plastic around that lath and then just used landscape staples. So it was really secure, right? It stood up against wind well, but, it was a little bit muddy in the wintertime to get in and out of there. Most of the temperature benefit that you're going to get here is going to be increasing daytime temperature. It's going to be a degree or two at night, but it's going to be that getting warm earlier in the morning and staying warm later in the afternoon, and that's going to support more rapid growth. If you really want to soup it up, there's all kinds of twists, right? So this is a raised bed that has soil heating cables, which can really work well. You put a low tunnel over that, and you can keep lettuce happy for all year. So on a small scale, if you really want to get into it, there's lots of cool things that you can do. All right, so I'm gonna be right on time. This is my last slide. So just kind of bring it all together. When we're thinking about cool season crops, especially for novice gardeners, or let's just be honest, those of us that are trying to juggle a whole bunch of different things at one time, leafy crops are more simple, right? Don't get frustrated with cauliflower and Brussels sprouts. Start with some leafy crops, get some good success. Focus on establishment, water, and nutrition early season. Be alert for pest and disease issues, especially those caterpillar feeders. And keep in mind that those modified environments, those tunnels and row covers can be great, but they also benefit everybody, right? So weeds will grow faster under there. We don't want to trap pests under there. So they can be great, but we do want to keep in mind that they do require a little bit of additional management as well. All right, well, that's my last slide. This is a January head of lettuce, which was from my very first winter in Tennessee. I moved here from Ohio, as many of you know, and when I harvested cool season crops in late December and early January, I knew I was in love, that I'd probably never go south again if I could grow this good of lettuce in the fall. So I hope that's kind of giving you a little bit of a range of what some of the great cool season options that we have, and I am ready to visit and take questions or comments or anything that you guys have.
Natalie, you did have one comment or a question in the chat, and it asked, what do you mean when you say overwinter? Because you talked about overwintering a lot of the crops.
Oh, yeah. So the most cold hardy of our cool season crops will be able to survive through the winter I won't promise this, but most years in Tennessee. And so kale and spinach are some of the ones that I talked about that would fall into that category. There are some others. Mache, like corn salad, those are some of the other leafy crops. And so whether in a traditional garden, but more commonly in a raised bed, you can plant those in the mid to late fall, especially kale. You can harvest a little bit in the fall. But those plants will live through the winter, and as soon as the light and the temperature start getting warmer in February and March, they will start to grow. And so you will actually often have your best yield in the early spring from those crops, because the days are getting longer. They're cool season crops. They love that. All of these crops love that 55 to 65 degree daytime temperature for very good crop growth. So sometimes, September, October planted kale may really give you the best benefit in March or April. In fact, now they're not like the most optimum right now. I'm not saying they're peak, but I literally have Toscano kale that is still in my raised bed right now, and in May and June, I actually had some pretty good kale salads that were from September and October plantings. we can't necessarily depend on that on some of our more tender crops, like lettuce in most years will get killed out. Beets, oftentimes those are a little bit, more variable, but especially for collards, kale, those types of things, we can get a lot of production out of them. Especially if we're using row covers, which can keep them healthy too. Mm-hmm.
I think that was all of the questions that were in the chat box, but if anybody has any questions, you can unmute your mics and you can ask Natalie your questions, or you can type it in the chat.
Oh, we have a lady on the call who says that they're relocating from Denver to Southern Tennessee next month, and I will say you are probably in for, like myself, some joyful fall gardening, and you won't really have to worry very much about wintertime snow load on your low tunnels and things like that.
Natalie, question on summer crops.
Yeah.
Even the soybean field this year, we got some soybeans up under our arm. When they get that tall, we don't get good yields. I had a gardener call me the other day, go out and look at his green beans. He's got vines, 8 foot high, but they're not yielding many beans. He planted in the wrong sign. What's the deal here?
Well, it could be a combination, Larry. There are a couple of things that come to mind. One is that, if he was feeding them a little bit, too much high nitrogen fertilizer, he could have just pushed their vegetative growth too much. But I'll also say that we had kind of a painful summer for some of our green beans. In my trials, I got decent yield out of my bush beans, my shorter season ones. But my pole beans did not do very well, because about the time that I was really supposed to be getting my heavy bloom set, we had those 95-degree days in the middle of July. And it could be, Larry, that he just got a lot of that bloom knocked off of him by heat, and he didn't get good pollination because that was in the hottest part of the summer.
Thank you. That's a better answer than I had.
Yeah. Yeah. We're always hypothesizing a little bit, but yeah, my pole beans were, it looked like they were going to be good, and then just not much came of it. Oh, Amanda's saying the same thing. Yeah, they got hit by temperature, and we had that stretch for like 3 weeks. So I mean, it wasn't like it just got the early blooms; it really kind of carried through and knocked a bunch of them off. I know that Darby put the publication links and stuff in the chat box, but those are a couple of, over the last couple of years, fairly new publications, and a lot of the cultivar names and stuff that I may have said really quickly in this presentation are listed on there, so that can be a handy way to get to those pretty quick.
Are there any more questions for Natalie there?
I know we got a pretty wide.
This is Kevin.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, you got a pretty good crowd on here. Do you want to talk just a brief minute about the variety trials and some of the things you're doing there?
Oh, sure. So far, we're kind of in the early season of getting in the evaluations from our home garden variety trials. And as many of you guys probably know, most of the time our variety trials have focused on warm season vegetables. So we do a lot of trials on beans, on cucumbers, on zucchini. And so that's what a lot of our home gardeners are growing. This year, actually, for the first time, we did have cool season crop in our trial. So we had collards in the trial this year, and we're hoping to add a little bit more of those cool season crops in there. It's kind of just been a little bit of a logistics thing for us, thus the focus on warm season crops. But each year we come out with a variety trial report, and we could send that too in the email, Darby. So we're actually finishing up our 4th year of the home garden variety trial. So we're starting to get, pretty good backbone of data, especially from our cucumbers and zucchini and beans. And so every year, we bring out that variety trial report, and we've got, comments and data from around the state on a lot of those really heavily grown crops. And then I do trials in Knoxville, replicated trials of all of those. So I've got yield data, to go with some of those. So as we go to fall, we're bringing in the evaluations from over 150 gardeners this year in our home garden variety trial from all across the state. And then we'll run the data in the fall, and the end of the year, January, the early part of February, we'll get that variety trial report out. But also, I know we've got Megan and Roger and some of you guys who are a little bit newer in the system. In kind of the month of February, we'll send that information about the home garden variety trial out to all the agents across the state. And so if you're doing, home garden series and those kinds of things in your county, you can share that information with people. This year we've got about 50 different counties represented across Tennessee. And of course, we're always looking for wider coverage. So yeah, we'll make sure that that y'all get that, and hopefully 2021 we'll have even a few more people involved. Well, if we've largely gotten to the end of questions, I really thank you guys for joining in. This has been fun. I very much enjoyed getting to share some fall season information, and see you guys. If you got any other questions or anything, by all means, feel free to shoot me an email. Darby, you have anything else you want to throw in there?
I don't. We'll have more of these type sessions going on, so we'll send out to agents the links to them again. But I think Kevin wants to have a quick priority team chat after we're done with this, so we're going to hang on to the meeting. But I know that you have another one that you've got to jump on here and
yeah, I'm going to hop off of here and hit a 2:00 Zoom. But once again, thanks so much for having me. I enjoy these Zoom meetings, but I hope I get to see y'all in person here before too long. Have a great afternoon.
Okay. Thank you, Natalie.